So you've got this, you formed this panel of sort of like-minded people. In terms of representing the views and the sentiments of the Manx public, have you got the backing? Do you think you've got the mandate on this sort of green issue?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So it's quite difficult to know, isn't it, without having spoken with absolutely everybody. But I do honestly think from my conversations with people since the IPCC report has been produced, and previously in my ongoing role as Green Issues Coordinator for the Manx Labour Party, that environmental issues are a big concern, especially for younger generations who obviously it will affect the most. So I do think that we do have a public mandate, which is something that we'll find out very soon with our page having gone live on Facebook today. When I checked it just before this interview, I think it had nearly 300 likes in a couple of hours. So I'm going to say that we do have a public mandate based on that. Let's hope so.
I appreciate that it's early days, and I suppose as with most governments, Brexit is putting in extra demand, and I think it's particular with DEFRA. But how do you guys plan on sort of lobbying on this front to the Environment Department to get them to prioritise climate change? I suppose, what's the first plan of action?
Okay, so we have 3 overarching aims that we've all agreed upon initially. They will be, first of all, to look at reducing emissions. I'm going to come back to that because that just needs a little bit of extra explanation. So reduce emissions, to invest in renewable energy sources, and to look at keeping our sustainability promises to UNESCO with regard to our biosphere status. And just to go back to that first one, looking at reducing emissions, what we are really hoping to get in place, first of all, is interim targets for emissions, targets to reduce emissions. So we were just talking earlier that we are the only jurisdiction in Europe that doesn't actually currently have interim targets in order to address how we're doing in terms of reducing emissions. So that's something that we really do need in place over here, because otherwise how can we measure ourselves?
So they would be put in place, I'd say, like every 5 years, say, and we check progress, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. So what we would be looking to do, so for example, the government has committed to reduce our emissions by 80% by the year 2050. But there are no interim emissions targets to check how well we're doing. So I don't really think any progress has been made, or if it has, it hasn't been tangible process. It's been very minimal. If we'd had a 5-year interim target for that, we would be checking that in 3 years' time. Sorry, we would be checking that this year to see how far we would be doing. So we need to break that down into smaller chunks in order to achieve that overall big target.
So I suppose a lot of this sentiment comes off the back of the IPCC report, which issued very rather drastic and urgent instructions. On a personal level, and perhaps from your Labour Party point of view, and on the Climate Change Coalition, what did you take from it? And I appreciate that's a big question.
Yes, that is a big question. But yeah, I mean, so do you know what? To be honest, Aaron, I read the report and was quite surprised at the optimistic tone of it. But that's because of my background in having been somebody who has read both scientific and geographic journals for a number of years. And the signs have been there. In fact, the IPCC have been telling us since their formation that human-induced climate change has the potential to cause catastrophic damage to our world. So with having read that for a number of years, it was actually what struck me about the report last month was that it had that level of optimism in it, and it was saying we can still turn this around. That really has made me feel quite galvanised to act. It can make you feel quite powerless when you're just continually hearing that we are on a collision course with our own demise and our own destruction at our own hands, and it can make us feel like, what can we possibly do? But actually, having been told now that we have this window of time, we do have to make huge changes, and that is quite daunting in itself. I accept that. But that we can actually still do this for the sake of our children and our grandchildren if we put in the effort.
On the report then, I'll pull some phrases from it, not to bring it down, I suppose, because you are feeling optimistic, but hot extremes, droughts, species loss and extinctions, sea level rise, coral reef bleaching, threats to food and water security, increases in poverty. As you mentioned, this sounds catastrophic. It sounds like a breakdown of human life as we know it, and the living world. So my question, I suppose, is the phrase climate change, does it actually do the potential damage to the planet justice?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Basically, what the IPCC report last month is looking at is the difference between a 1.5 degree global average level of global warming and a 2 degree. So previously, in the Paris Agreement, a lot of countries had committed to trying to keep our planet down to a 2 degree level of warmth, global warming. But the IPCC are now saying that at 2 degrees, there will be catastrophic impact upon our current civilization, and if we keep it to 1.5, that will maximise our potential to carry on as a species. Because we're talking about such small numbers, it's actually quite difficult for us to comprehend the difference that might make. But if we're looking at 2 degrees, so at current trends, if we carry on the way that we're going now in terms of emissions and not investing in renewables, we are looking at a 2 degrees rise in the average global temperature by 2040. So that's 22 years' time. You know, both of us will still be around. My children will be very young adults. That's something that we can tangibly say will affect us within our lifetime. A 2 degree rise in 22 years. And at 2 degrees, what the scientists have told us is that the melting of the polar ice caps will have reached a tipping point at which dozens of our major cities will be flooded. So that's kind of you're moving into apocalyptic territory there, aren't you? It doesn't mean that all life on the planet will be wiped out, but it does mean that civilization will change unalterably if we do let our planet reach that tipping point. So that's why the IPCC are recommending that we keep it down to 1.5 degree average global warming.
And then I suppose going back to the original question then, notions of climate change, it seems quite harmless, but when you dig a little deeper, there's of course there's a breakdown in ecology and the living world prospectively round the corner. To sort of quote our environment minister, he mentioned about crying wolf too many times in regards to certain warnings and stuff, and I appreciate sort of the sentiment he's trying to get across there. And I suppose what's our responsibility now as, you know, people like myself perhaps as a member of the media, what's my responsibility, policymakers, people who are part of green groups, when it comes to addressing it as climate change? Should we not be referring to it to make sure it hits home and makes people realise that perhaps this is no longer climate change, this is climate breakdown?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a great point, actually. I think that a lot of the media presentation on a global scale around climate change issues has really negatively impacted upon this as a movement. And even up until last year, the BBC were representing a climate change denier alongside somebody who was a scientist, as if that was a balanced debate, when actually the BBC had to come out and apologise and say that they wouldn't do that anymore following a spate of complaints about that. But they were up until last year presenting that as if it was a balanced debate, when actually we do know that the vast majority of scientists have been behind the science behind human-induced climate change for decades. It's not really a question. You can't have an opinion on whether there is human-induced climate change happening right now. You can have an opinion upon what we should do about it, but the science is too clear to be accepting that that would be a balanced debate. So in answer to your question, as media presenters, I think that to accept that we know that this is a fact and to accept that we want to do something about it would be a great way to frame this issue from here on in.